All right, again, everyone, welcome to the second installment of our Redesign the Future series that's hosted by the Johns Hopkins University Division of Integrative Learning and Life Design. As people are still filtering in, as we have people joining us, what I'm going to do is, before we get started with the formal program, we're going to go ahead and open up a poll just so that my fellow presenters and myself can get a sense of who is joining us here today. So hopefully you can see the demographic poll on here, and just as you select, feel free to select what best describes you, whether you're a Hopkins undergraduate or graduate student, an alum, a member of the Hopkins administration or faculty, a community member, or someone joining us as a non-JHU student, a non-JHU administrator or staff, or just none of these. Just give us a sense of we'd love to hear who's joining us today. All right. Why don't can we close out the poll now and just get a sense, kind of a final version? All right, looks like we have a nice variety of people joining us. Students here at Hopkins, Hopkins administrators and faculty and staff from our various divisions, as well as administrators and faculty and staff from other institutions and people who don't fall into these categories. So we have a nice blend of people who are here to join us for today. So I think it's very helpful. I think all of you will find some interesting things to take from this conversation over the next hour. So thank you all again for joining us, and I think today promises to be a very engaging and interesting conversation. So by way of introduction, my name is Justin Lortz. I serve as the Director of Life Design for the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences at the Life Design Lab on the Johns Hopkins University Homewood campus. I know it's a bit of a mouthful. I also serve along with my colleagues, Michelle Jones, who you met in the last session, and Setu Ben Lair, who you will meet next month in our third session, We Challenge the Future. The three of us serve as life design ambassadors, and so we help spread the principles of life design and design thinking to the Hopkins community as abroad through events such as this. So today's conversation is going to build on our first session, and that took place last month and was titled We Connect Here. And that conversation tried to address the ways in which we can use the design thinking process, design thinking mindsets, and life design mindsets of reframing to accept the realities of COVID-19. But to do so in a way that allows for possibility and opportunities. This is something that our colleagues at the Stanford Life Design Lab, Dave Burnett and Bill Evans, would call generative acceptance. So the conversation last month was really focused on seeing this moment as an opportunity for new possibilities, new ideas, new paths. Today's session is now gonna take the next step. It's titled We Explore Possibilities. So I'm joined today by two distinguished Hopkins alumni who are going to offer their thoughts on how we can embrace that designer mindset and start to define achievable goals that reflect our own values and interests, collaborate with others to generate ideas and hopefully wild, crazy, innovative, outside the box ideas, and really think how we can start creating actionable steps to move our careers and our lives and our employer roles forward, so that we can continue to make progress despite the challenges that we face today. So I will say at the outset, for those of you joining us, this is really designed to be a conversation. So the panelists and I are going to be having conversations and talking and feeding off of one another, but I do encourage all of you who are joining us today to ask questions. If something is interesting that comes up or you want to know more, please feel free to use the Q&A box on the Zoom panel down below, and I will try to get to questions that arise throughout the talk. All right, so now without further ado, I would like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves, beginning with Sadaf.
Great, thanks so much, Justin. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm really excited to be here. As Justin just mentioned, my name is Sadaf Khan. I am also from the Krieger School. I graduated with a master's in 2014 with the Global Security and Global Security Studies degree with a specialization in strategic studies. Really excited to kind of answer any questions and chat with you all about my experiences. I'm currently working at Facebook on what we call content policy. And so essentially I'm on the team that writes and implements the policies for what is and is not allowed across our platforms. I've been there roughly a year, and doing that after spending 11 years in public service working in Capitol Hill. I worked on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and I was in charge of all US policy toward the Western Hemisphere, which is Latin America and the Caribbean, so everything from Canada down to Chile. So happy to have you here and happy to answer any questions. And really look forward to chatting. I know we are in a very unique time these days. And so I think the best we can do is kind of collaborate with each other and learn from each other. So hopefully I can contribute a small amount to that today.
Great. Sharon?
Thanks, Justin. Hello, everyone. I'm Sharad Balyan. I'm a user experience designer who just graduated this May from the Design Leadership MA/MBA program that we have with Carrie and Micah. I'm waiting to join my full-time job as a design strategist at BrainScope, which is a medical devices company that's local here in Maryland. In the past, I have been involved in designing some of the image editing and video editing software at Adobe. So if you use Photoshop or Premiere Pro, you might be using some of my work. Post that, I decided that I wanted to work in education. So I joined an education startup in personalized education for primary school children. That experience led me to realize that I need more business chops, and that sort of convinced me to head over and learn more about how to merge the worlds of design and business over here at Carrie. We have a fantastic program that bridges design and business, which is the MA/MBA program, which I graduated from. No pride there.
Great. Well, thank you both for joining us. It sounds just from your introductions that both of you have had careers that have already sort of pivoted to new opportunities and changed directions a bit. So as you look at your work and your industry, how do you see it being impacted by current world events? And have you or your peers noticed areas for opportunity, for innovation, for growth in your fields?
Sure, happy to start that off. And I think it's really interesting that Sharad and I have two completely different backgrounds. So hopefully that gives a really good kind of diversity of opinions to the audience. I'll speak really briefly actually on kind of what I would consider both of my careers, because I think they're two industries that are affected really uniquely by everything that's going on. I actually graduated from undergrad in 2009. And so which, if anyone here can relate, that was in the height of the Great Recession. So this is the second potentially Great Recession that I'm trying to continue to stay employed through. And so the first one is Congress and DC and the government is ironically one of the most recession-proof industries in the country because people still have to work and people still have to vote. And so it's interesting how every job in Capitol Hill is impacted by COVID, whether it's because you have constituents that need help or are battling the virus, you have to liaise with governors to figure out what the guidance is to make that clear. Also, there's the funding bills, there's the foreign policy, global security implications of the spread of the virus. And so everybody who works on the Hill or in that space is kind of dealing every day with the challenge. I think the upside is because it's not a job that is dependent on the economy, there aren't life cycles of layoffs if the economy is struggling, and so those opportunities are always available. It's an election year, and so everyone is still hiring. The downside is, as there's a squeeze on the other parts of the economy, more people try and filter into the industry, which is why I think conversations like this are so key, because networking is the bread and butter for Congress. Now, Facebook and the tech sector, on the other hand, are impacted in a completely different way, as everyone has had to shift their lifestyles to working from home. Well, lo and behold, the products are being used at a tremendously larger rate than they were before, huge increases in user bases, you know, and there's a whole technical side to making sure that's working. But from the policy side, there are questions about, you know, what do we do when the CDC or the WHO is saying everyone needs to wear a mask or everyone needs to take certain healthcare precautions, but the president of a country, any country, whether it's the US or Brazil or otherwise, is saying, no, 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 you don't have to do that. How do we combat the spread of misinformation on our platforms about these things? So I think both of my, you know, main jobs and careers that I've had are incredibly impacted by COVID. I think the upside and interesting thing is they are both in positions to continue hiring, and they are both in positions that need to be innovating and actually adding to their staffs during this time versus reducing. And so happy to chat more about that. But I have found that, you know, Facebook is having to move incredibly fast to keep up with the changes, with the flux of people kind of using Zoom calls and wanting to be able to connect to their loved ones all the time and conduct business like completely on their platforms. And so whether it's from a safety perspective or a voice perspective of giving people access and connectivity, the industry is, you know, innovating at an even faster rate to keep up with it. So, you know, that's hopefully good news for any recent grads or people who are on the job market.
Yeah, thanks, Sadaf. That's interesting. I'll take this opportunity to speak about healthcare and education, since those are the spaces that I've had an eye on. There's a quote going around, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard. We've been thrust into 2030 with the infrastructure of 2020. I think that sort of sums up where we are and the struggles that we have. Healthcare innovation has been moving at a glacial pace since the last several decades. There's been legislation that helps improve online consultation, cross-state, cross-nation certification for physicians, which has been in the works for decades. But as a result of the pandemic, I think I'm not going to dwell on the pandemic's sort of disastrous effects, but some of the good that's coming out of it is that legislation in the last 8 to 12 weeks has been passed that has increased interoperability of health data across hospitals so that patients can have that accessible. I think it's been 5 years since we've been trying to see progress on that. In a lot of my courses at Carey, we talked about the glacial pace, and it was quite ironic that as soon as I was graduating, all of these changes were happening. I think all of these present like very unique opportunities. I like to see them as that. Healthcare is innovating at the fastest rate ever, and that gives a tremendous landscape for change. The same is happening to education. Aside from the fact that schools, colleges are not you know, perfectly in place to have in-person sessions, we've had online learning for a while, but it has been the first version of online learning. I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg on the sort of changes and improvements that we're going to be seeing there. And I think it's a somber time to sort of take a look at what impact is happening and how can you play a role in that?
A follow-up question, because I think both of you know that this is really a time of opportunity and really fast innovation. We've been forced into the future very quickly. And so it seems like there's, in both of your areas that you work in, lots of opportunities, lots of possibilities, lots of room for growth and for people to find new roles in these industries. But as you think about, you know, in your own career, sort of the next steps that you take, the work that you do, how do you think about aligning those opportunities and sort of aligning those opportunities with your own values, with your own kind of long-term career goals in terms of how you think about work, how you think about what you value? Because I think it's easy to get lost when you say, oh, there's just so many opportunities and so much growth. It's easy to get overwhelmed and say, okay, well, what step do I take? How do you make sense of that, both in your current role, but as you think about your career and going forward?
Sure. So I think that's a really interesting question. I personally like to bucket things into short, medium, and long term is essentially how I try and approach, whether it's a large career project or whether it was when I was like scoping out the policy or the agenda for the committee, or if we're scoping out a project at Facebook on like, where do we want to see our policies go in the next 6 to 12 months? And what are all the things we now have to essentially readjust and recalibrate for because of COVID? And to me, I think separating into short, medium, long term has always been helpful. Whether it was like about these job projects or like, hey, where do I want to be in 2 to 5 years? I'm actually a believer in kind of saying that it's okay to not have a 5-year plan. It's okay to, not have like exactly an idea of where you want to go, because I think for the first 10 to 15 years easily of your career, we're always so worried about being boxed in, or we're so worried about taking something that's going to redefine our path in the way we don't want. And I just don't believe that to be true. I find these things to be incredibly fluid. I think you can make, the opportunity for yourself how you want. And so you should be open to everything and open to every conversation. That obviously leads to the exact issue you just pointed out, Justin, is then, okay, well then there's too many options, and how do I factor in what thing to do next? And I think it's just, maybe it's not a science for me. It's what is the combination of something that excites me and that's available to me, and how do I get there? So I'm all about, how do I get there in the short term? Are there people I need to meet? Are there conversations I need to have? Is there a degree or a program that's going to get me there? And then in the medium and long term, it's much more about sketching out, okay, I want to end up in X, Y, and Z place. I wanted to end up on the committee, or I want to end up, freedom of expression issues are incredibly important to me, which is how I found myself here. But I never thought I was going to work at Facebook. I was really interested in human rights. I was really interested in policy issues. So I worked in Congress. It seemed like more of a natural fit. Okay, these are the things I care about. I'm going to work on foreign affairs. How do I get there? But the pivot to Facebook actually came about because I said, well, I really care about freedom of expression. I really care about, safety versus voice, and how do we balance these two really important, but sometimes at odds concepts. And that kind of just led me to, okay, well, who are the people who are being innovative in that space right now? And, or maybe who are the people who need to be improving in that space and need to be kind of gearing up in that space. And that's how you kind of like pivot slowly. So there was never for me kind of like a grand plan to end up, working in Silicon Valley or something like that. But you kind of take things step by step. What are the macro ideas that I'm really passionate about? And then who are the people that are working on those ideas? And then filter down one level. Great. Who are the people I need to be in touch with to learn more about these ideas and getting myself there? So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's a little bit about my mental process.
Yeah, I like that, because it sort of shows you have this really deep interest in something that you really value is freedom of expression, and the way in which that value has taken you to these very different career paths. And, sort of thinking about, no one would ever, when you first graduated from college or started college, think, oh, I want to go work in for Facebook in 10 years doing this. I mean, Facebook kind of existed, but it wasn't in the same place you did now. But having that set of values as these opportunities have come up, you've been able to say, okay, that actually aligns with what I'm really interested in.
Yep, I think that's exactly right. I think the job I have now didn't exist 10 years ago. The job I have now actually didn't even exist 5 years ago. And I think, and I think Sharad will be able to speak to this much more than I do in the innovative space, is that those are the kind of careers we're all working toward. The job you want 10 years from now probably doesn't exist right now. So think about what guides you and moves you, and you'll find yourself there.
Yeah, has it been the same for you, Sharad?
Largely, yes. I think that was a very nice story, Sadaf. I found myself thinking back to the things that drove me on to the steps that I took. And I think at the core of it lies what interests and what values do you have. I think For me, what happened was early experiences in education drove me to go and work at an education startup, which was trying to address some of those challenges. Later, life is fluid. You keep changing, you keep growing. I think the important thing is to understand when have you outgrown where you are and when are you ready for the next challenge. Other sort of life experiences for me led me to decide that I wanted to have impact in healthcare and in lifestyle healthcare, to be particular. While it's going to be a little weird, my designer friends always laugh at me, I like to use this matrix for deciding what to do next. It's a simple 2x2 matrix of impact versus interest. And I think that really helps. It forces you to prioritize and place things in some order. And that really helps me decide. The funny thing is sometimes things that win in that matrix aren't the things that I end up doing because your interest and the thing that you're really keen to do yourself takes over. So I think the important thing is being able to have, like you described, Sadaf, being able to have an approach where you can access people who are either working in the space that you want to work in or have worked and have had experience there, and maybe who have left that space. I find that divergence of sort of perspectives and being able to tap into that being very important in order to form your own opinion on what you want to do next. I think what's interesting right now is everyone is super accessible. I think even a couple of years ago, it was not easy to connect with people, but now, specifically now in this time frame, everyone is accessible over LinkedIn and willing to give you 20 minutes of their time to have a conversation. I think it's really important to have that line of communication open, in addition to having your interests and having a direction on what to do next.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, both of you have touched on this idea. I think Sadaf sort of talked about networking being the bread and butter of, you know, in DC, and sort of this idea that the importance of divergent thought, this is a great opportunity to expand your network. How have you, how have you done that? How, sort of thinking about, over the course of your career, how have you tried to bring in different ideas, different people, divergent thoughts that, this is a practice that we talk about in design thinking or life design, radical collaboration, right? This idea that the best idea, the best path for you is not going to be one that you have yourself, but one that you generate from a group of people who hopefully don't think like you or share your same background, that are going to give you different ideas and help you get out of your box. How do you, how have you used that type of thinking as you've gone through your career steps?
Thanks, Justin. I think that's a great question, and also, particularly interesting when you think about DC, because groupthink is a huge problem in DC, and for better or for worse, there are certainly similarities in the types of personalities that are drawn to DC. And so you get a lot of actually repetitive thinking, or you kind of hear the same talking points and the same things from people over and over. And so you do have to put in a conscious effort to have a divergence of opinion and to kind of be able to speak from different, speak from a place where you've gathered a diversity of views. For me, it a little bit is about just going out and doing the work, like talk to as many people as you can, always be open to what they're saying, trying to pull on threads of what is there something they're getting at that's important to you? I mean, it's about trying to find as many different types of people. The other thing that at least, is interesting to me, and I want to kind of, something I said before, and I think applies now, is I think a lot of things we're talking about today also come from an extreme place of privilege, that we are very lucky to be able to sit here and just think about what are the things we care about most and what are the things we want to work on the most. And in that same, because of that opportunity that we have and this great education that we got at Johns Hopkins, is I try and utilize not just, the people I would talk to at work, but I utilize my family. I utilize my family friends. I don't care, nobody in my family does anything even closely remotely related to what I do. People are in consulting, they're in healthcare, they're in finance, they're in tech. And by tech, I mean like IT software engineering, so very different. And if there's someone that you share values with, if there's someone that you trust, if there's someone that you appreciate the way they think, then their opinions are just as valuable as someone who might work at the State Department or might work at the dream company where you want a job, because it's all about kind of how did they get where they are today? How did they process through these things? How did they think about these things? And I think that's actually where the diversity of opinions comes in, is they've kind of all dealt with things in completely different industries that might have no overlap to yours, but there are common threads that pull through and that you can kind of weave together and use to your advantage. And I think that gives you a little bit of a competitive and strategic edge when you're dealing with your own industry, because the chances are people in your industry are just surrounded by a lot of people that think like them. And the more senior folks get, the less likely they are to be surrounded by people who are going to question them or challenge them. And so when you kind of speak to people that are a little bit outside the box, but are really great cognitive or analytical thinkers, you get some new ideas, you just get some fresh ideas. And I think, that's just something that I've tried to keep in mind, whether it's asking my dad for advice, who has 30 years of experience in a corporate culture, which is completely different from Facebook and completely different from government, or it's honestly keeping in touch with the alumni here at Hopkins. I bother them probably more often than they assumed I would after I graduated several years ago. And I think they've always been a good check for me.
Yeah. Has that been your experience, Sharon?
I think so. I think Sadaf said a lot of what I would have talked about. I think it's very important, just to add one additional layer to what Sadaf has already said, is it's very important to put your own opinions out there. And while Twitter, for example, is sometimes a vitriolic medium, but it can connect you to people who think very differently from you. And I think there's a power of directed networking, and then there's this serendipitous networking that it allows you to do. So I think just putting the ideas that you're getting, the thoughts that you're getting in the beta sort of stage that they are out there, LinkedIn, Twitter, wherever, and hearing what other people have to say to that. There's immense power in directed networking, of course, which Sadaf talked about. And by that, I mean things like, what can a poet add to someone who's writing ML for image recognition? It's surprising the value that can be added to someone who studies poetry. So I think the value is found in surprising places. And I think diversity is super valuable. That's been my experience, at least. I've been fortunate to have friends who are engineers, friends who are artists, friends who are in movie production and things like that. And I think while seemingly innocuous conversations have led me down very powerful paths. So I think it's, being open, one, accessing diversity, and two, being open to what a seemingly innocuous remark can get you.
I like that, because I think what I hear both of you saying is that there's a certain necessary intentionality to creating, generating diverse ideas, that as you move through your career, there's a tendency to, you're just going to hang out with other engineers, you're just going to hang out with other investment bankers, you're just going to hang out with other artists. And so you have to actively work to, whether in sort of in-person forms or through social media forms, to generate, to build that network. And to, I like also what you said, Sharon, about being willing to state your opinion and put it out there, to have, not just so people can give you thumbs up and say, hey, where to go, but you can have disagreement, to sort of hear what other sides are, as a way to constantly generate those different ideas. Have you, as you kind of, thinking, sort of picking up, because you said you have these different, can you talk more, Sharon, about how you've cultivated, those, you said you have artist friends, you have all of these different friends. Can you offer tips for people who are worried about entering into the world of work, who are in the world of work, who feel that their groups are not generating the diverse ideas that they might need?
Yeah, sure. I think in the current context that we're in, it's difficult to do in-person socialization, go to art fight or art battle or things like that, to take the example of the arts. But I think what's very interesting is, I think spaces like Reddit, Instagram, I don't think a lot of artists are that active on LinkedIn, but these other spaces, you will find a lot of people active, especially Behance. Go where I think these people hang out. And I think while it's very strange for me to hear sometimes an opinion that engineers aren't creative. I have met some of the most creative people who are engineers. It's just one of those myths. So if you are interested in a particular art form, whether that's music, media, whatever, I think there are communities out there where you can actually go and engage with people like that. And I think the world has become very small in that respect, where there are a lot of people who are welcoming and opening. I've met friends while playing online games, World of Warcraft. It's amazing who you'll find, as long as you're open to finding them and open to sharing a little about yourself. It's not necessary that you tell people your life story, but your interests. People converge on ideas, interests, and positivity. That's what I find, no matter where they are.
We have a question coming in from the audience, which I think is really, really timely to what we're talking about, from Crossy. To both panelists, could you share a story of when you last came across a divergent idea or topic or practice that helped you think differently about your work or inspired you to approach a work project differently than what you've done?
Yeah, I don't know, Shred, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first? I can.
Well, I'll give a small example and then you can go ahead. So this is an example from when I was working in the education startup. We were building these tools for teachers to be able to teach in the classroom. And somehow the discussion turned to someone who started talking about the economics of being a teacher in India. And in India, a teacher is considered to be a guru, but yet they're not paid, and there's commoditization of the industry. And so we were talking back and forth about this challenge and the state of how the profession has become. And it struck me that the tools that we were building were very dry in that respect. And what the challenge that we had at that point was getting teachers to adopt these tools. From that conversation, we sort of took the path of making the tools more personalized and made them feel like they were the owners. The ownership of the tools were with the teachers. They were giving powers to the teachers, as opposed to taking powers from them. I think that sort of divergent discussion led us to make these tools, which teachers then started adopting because they felt that they were adding to their self-image. So a conversation about a profession and self-image translates into better adoption of a tool inside a classroom. I think that was very fascinating, but it's also what should happen, I guess, or one of the ways in which it should happen.
Awesome. So I'll build on that. And this is something that I mentioned earlier, is this role that I've just recently undertaken at Facebook, where our job is to write and implement these policies. And kind of, coming from my background with human rights and governance. And it's very interesting because, as I'm sure everyone on this call is aware, Facebook tends to be in the news a bit these days, and people have some strong opinions on what the company does, what the company doesn't do. what content comes down, what content stays up. And, I think before I work there, while I work there, I have, strong thoughts about all of this as well. And what really struck me is how much you there's the concept of you want to give the most speech to the most people, right? You want people to be able to speak. You want people to be able to say what they want. And it seems sometimes really interesting. It seems sometimes really obvious, especially in the press, like, how could this decision have been made? Why would this have happened? And one thing I've really learned is when you talk to experts that specifically focus just on speech and the right to speech and human rights principles, you can never quite tell what the ripple effects are of any one decision of, either deciding something is too unsafe to be left on the platform or deciding that this is something that needs to be heard. What I have learned immediately is that there is actually no obvious answer ever. It is never, ever, ever as simple as one thinks it's going to be. And it could be the most innocuous thing, or it could be the most, defamatory and controversial statement, and everyone thinks it's black and white. And the second you start speaking to experts about different parts of the world, about different religions, different cultures, the way different statements are interpreted, you realize that, just absolutely nothing is as simple as it seems. And so I think we are actually daily faced with these challenges of getting these divergent opinions and views, where something can be extremely upsetting to one group of people or one audience, and it can be extremely empowering to another. And so figuring out how to think through that on a regular basis is something that I'm actually just learning to do better day by day right now. And I think it kind of goes back to what Sharad said earlier, is this is where there is a real value in surrounding yourself with different people and trying to learn and understand from people who have completely different mindsets and completely different experiences, to try and think about things differently. And so I think right now, when we get faced with a problem, the first thing I do is think not about what my first impression is, but what are all of the other ways someone might be able to interpret this, or what are the other ways that someone might kind of take this into account, and go from there, understanding that I'm bringing my own biases to anything. I'm bringing my own, very particular lens to anything that I look at. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but that's a little bit how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if you could talk more, because I think that, in academia, if you're in a classroom, sort of thinking through all the different ripple effects, as you said, that's a very important intellectual exercise to go through, to think about how your decisions might impact people differently. But I think ultimately in our day-to-day careers, we have to do something, right? We have, often we need to take a step forward. So if you could talk a bit, Sadaf, about in your current role, how you take that step, how you say, okay, so there's all of these competing things, all of these potential ripple effects, but, based on the available data, here's how we're going to move forward. What's that process like for you?
Sure. So the first thing I'll say is, you never should, if there's a decision with that many ripple effects, if you are making that decision all by yourself, you are in a dangerous situation. So you should find yourself out of that situation as soon as possible and bring other people in. And so that's the first piece of caution I would give anyone. I think, and I'm happy to go into, more detail with anyone, but at a later time, I won't bore you, but there is an extensive process, right? Where we would take in expert opinions, where we would take in the opinions of people on the ground, where you take in the opinions of people that are in academia or who are experts in your field. And you weigh all of these things against what I think Sharad and I have both been speaking about a lot, is the values and the end goal. So this is where you are balancing the short term of looking at content or looking at certain issues that the companies might be dealing with. And then you balance that against what are your long-term goals of where you want to see this going? What are the direction you're trying to go, and what goals are you trying to achieve when it comes to the values of the company or the values that you yourself are espousing? And you have to balance, and you have to make a judgment call. And obviously there are extenuating circumstances, like, is there a risk of real world harm? Are there immediate people in danger? And that clearly shifts, from a theoretical perspective on, what is an important discussion that someone should hypothetically be allowed to have versus you know, that doesn't really matter anymore if we know that something could come of this immediately. And so I think it just takes me back to short, medium, and long term, is like, are there short-term impacts of this? And are those impacts positive or negative? And how does that change your decision making? And if there are not immediate short-term impacts, if it's more medium or if there's more long-term impacts, then you have the time and the privilege to draw from the expertise to go back and match those against your values. And eventually you have to kind of, if you are in the role that you're making that decision, you have to trust the people around you, and you have to trust the information that you have. And that trust is incredibly important before making a decision.
Great, thank you. Shara, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think what, thank you, Sada, for that really nice answer. I think in situations where I've been faced with ambiguity, which is hard to cut through and has a lot of decision-making layers, can have potentially outstanding positive effects and outstanding negative effects. I think the best thing to do, and what I've done in the past, is to do something that's called a sprint. It's a design thinking technique, not to hype that up too much, but basically it says get decision makers and people who have to implement those decisions together, a diverse group, and go through this stage of defining, exploring what future outcomes could be like, and converging then. So I think some of these decisions, which have many parameters, they take time for you to converge and form an opinion. And I think the design process really helps in getting a lot of perspectives together in a way where they are more additive, is what I'd say, where a certain drawback of one approach could actually be valuable in another approach. So I won't go into the sprint framework. There's a lot of content out there. It's Google's sprint process. I can post a link. But I think groups of divergent individuals are really good at working through ambiguity like that.
Yeah, this is great, because we have a couple questions in the chat box. It's sort of around the how, like how do I identify or ideate on solutions? And design thinking gives us a framework to do that. But if you're in an organization that hasn't bought into design thinking or isn't familiar with design thinking, what do you guys think are some of the necessary seeds, the necessary preconditions for divergent ideas to exist within an organization? What are some things that, especially if people want to go to an organization that embraces diverse ideas, what are some of the things they should be looking at for an organization to have in order to foster divergent ideas?
Sure. I'm happy to take a quick stab at that. And this is where I think this applies to all, probably across many industries or many careers, but I think this is where my time on the Hill is potentially useful to discuss. And it's because it's not known for its diversity. I don't know what the latest numbers are, but I'm sure by any metric, they would not be considered an incredibly diverse workforce. And so to me, divergent ideas come from diversity. And it's really, diversity is incredibly, incredibly important. And not just diversity, but diversity and inclusion. So usually you see those two words together, and they go hand in hand. One of them just doesn't exist without the other. And so when you're looking for a place that, is open to a diversity of opinions, is open to understanding divergent thinking, they need to be diverse themselves. And I don't necessarily, and diversity comes in a lot of many ways. This doesn't just have to do with race or gender, although those are incredibly, incredibly important aspects of diversity. They come from socioeconomic background, religion, culture, everything, gender identity. All of these things are incredibly important because these are the life experiences those people go through. Those are the things they bring to the table that shape those different forms of thinking. And so just one, having diversity is incredibly important. Second is the inclusion piece. There are a lot of folks out there that like to tout percentages of, you know, gender parity or pay parity, and things like that are great. But what really matters is, are those people who have diverse thinking and diverse views, are they empowered? Are they empowered to take leadership roles? And so I think an interesting point is, and I do not know the exact numbers, I can look it up, is at some point on Capitol Hill, there was a lot of talk about how the statistics are, you know, maybe they're not 50-50, but say like 40% are women. Like, okay, that's pretty good. Well, great. What happens when you start cross-sectioning for seniority? What happens when you start cross-sectioning for chiefs of staff or legislative councils or staff directors? Then you see the numbers drop precipitously. And so I think, you know, making sure people are empowered to be included is really important, to make sure these people are in leadership positions. And so that's something I personally do look for is, you know, and that's somewhat, I guess, of a new trend of companies trying to tout their diversity, or kind of be able to talk about that. And that's great. But to me, those statistics and those numbers mean nothing if the people aren't empowered to have active roles and to like have an active voice. And because that's how you're going to be able to get those voices at the table. Like I think, like Sharad said, that willingness to want to learn from people, that willingness to want to understand where people come from, that culture is what I'm looking for if I want to understand if people are, you know, trying to shy away from groupthink and are trying to kind of have real innovative solutions.
I like that, because it's not just about percentages on a website or thing, but it's like who is in the room, who's generating these ideas, who's making these decisions, who's able to have a voice in the direction of the company. And this kind of actually gets me back to where we start, you know, where we've been at, you know, about a half hour ago, sort of thinking about this being a great time to talk to people, that people are open to having different ideas and having these conversations. As you talk to people, do you have advice for how, when you're doing an informational interview or when you're talking to someone about their company, how you can get at that inclusion part, you know, how you can get a sense of who is at the table, who's part of these conversations, where are these ideas coming from? Do you have advice for that?
Sure. I'm a big fan of asking questions pretty directly. And so, you know, as long as you're not doing it in an antagonistic way, as long as you're not coming at it with any assumptions about where that person may fall on an issue, I think it's best to just ask these people, you know, what are they doing on inclusion? How do they value? How do they see these things as contributing factors to decision making? Do they think it's important? Is that something that's on their minds? And just kind of asking them, you know, and I think in policy that's incredibly relevant. Great, like how are you constantly making sure you're avoiding groupthink? How are you constantly making sure you're avoiding surrounding yourself by yes men or yes women? And just kind of seeing what they say. I mean, 9 times out of 10, I find that when you just ask people direct questions, it says a lot, because they are either incredibly prepared and ready to answer you because it's something they've already thought about and it's something they've, you know, already considered and have an answer, or one of two things happen. They are incredibly intrigued by it and they want to do more and learn more, which is obviously a really good sign. Or, you know, you might get a little bit of pushback. You might get a little bit of insight if there's some hesitancy there. And I think that, you know, that's the best way to do it. And I think, like Sharad said, these informational interviews are really important. People are willing to give you 20 minutes and you want to use 20 minutes wisely. So I always recommend like knowing yourself, what your elevator pitch is, but more importantly, what are the things you want to get out of that person? That the person you're talking to is very likely going to decide within the first 3 minutes if they're going to be willing to help you and how much they're going to stick their neck out for you. So you should have your asks ready, and you should be ready. And if diversity and inclusion and diversity of opinion is important to you, then you should ask them what they think about that and who they think are great people or great network thought leaders in those spaces that they could connect you with. And I think that'll show a lot about how much time that person has spent thinking about these things.
Thank you. Sharon, is that kind of any other advice that you might give for people who are interested in learning more through the informational interview process and getting at some of these issues? Oh, you're muted.
I think Sadaf has covered most of them. The only thing that I'd add is, since someone has given you 20 minutes and you have certain outcomes that you want out of it, it's really good to sort of give either direction to the discussion or make sure that the discussion ends up in a later, a further discussion down the line. I think a framework that I like to use is, myself, my team, and my organization, which sometimes turns into myself, my family, and my community. But those sort of things help engage people in a discussion where when they see that you have some values and some values that they can relate to, they start engaging more. Otherwise, it can turn into a dry discussion, which you really don't want it to be.
Thank you. I think we got most of the questions here. There's one more coming in. So this is an interesting question from my colleague Tessa. This idea about happenstance. How do you play? When your best laid plans go out the window. You had your 2-year plan or whatever, it goes out the window. How do you make what we would call an audacious move, right? Your plans have fallen through. Now's a moment to make that big jump. Can you talk about times where you've done that, where you've had a plan, it's fallen through, and you've been able to pivot, but pivot in a way that went beyond your wildest dreams, or went beyond your planning? It's like, I'm going to take this chance and let's see how it works out. Has that ever happened to either of you? And what was that like?
Well, I can take a shot at that one first, Sadaf. So interestingly, I've worked at 2 startups. Both startups led me to a point where I decided that the goals for which I came here have not been met, and not been met by a mile. And I think that realization and also comes very closely with what is it that was not met, what happened. So plans are very interesting. They never turn out the way you expected from them, but they always give you a sense of what it is that you really wanted. I think that sets you up for audacious moves. I think for me, in both situations, I have made dramatic jumps. But I think the one thing that I would say, which has allowed for those audacious moves, is being, and this is a weird statement to make, but being relatively unfettered, in the sense, in my sense, it was being debt-free, which I'm not anymore, but it enabled me to make moves when I discovered that my plans had failed, and they'd failed for whatever reasons, but they showed me that this is what I really wanted, or this is what I need to do next. So I think that's the good thing about plans. They always, you might meet them to a certain extent, or you might miss them by a mile, but they'll show you what you missed and what you really want. So that's what I like about them. If you didn't have the plan, you'll not know what you missed.
Go ahead, Sada.
Sure. So I'll tell a really brief story that happened to me on Capitol Hill, and this is kind of why I've mentioned a couple times that I really don't believe in people being pigeonholed. I really think that people should have incredibly open minds about their career paths. And, I don't know if anyone here on this call is familiar with the structure of working on Capitol Hill, but there's, just basically 5 or 6 jobs you could possibly have. And there's just you kind of start entry level as a staff assistant, and you move up the ranks, and you either, go into communications, or you go into policy, or you stay on the admin side. And so I was in a situation where I felt like I wasn't, I had to move out to move up. And a lot of people were cautioning me against it. Almost everyone was saying, you're going to leave your job where you're working for someone who's already on the committee you want to work for, and you're going to go work for some other member that doesn't care about these things, and you're going to go be his executive assistant. You're going to go be his scheduler. You're going to do admin stuff. This is taking you farther and farther away from your goals of policy. You're going to be pigeonholed into the admin role because you went from staff assistant to scheduler and all this sort of thing. So essentially everyone was like, don't do this, don't do this. But I knew if I stayed where I was going to get stuck, and I was going to get bored, and I was just going to have to essentially wait for someone ahead of me to quit, so there would be an extra space open that I could move up. Hill offices are really small. There's only like 7 people in an office, so it doesn't matter how you're performing. There's no upward mobility if the person above you isn't going anywhere. And I had the privilege of working for an incredibly, incredibly kind member, and so nobody wanted to leave. And so anyway, I took this risk. I said, okay, well, I'm going to, work for this other person. I'm not gaining any more experience. Let me gain another skill. Let me learn about a different delegation. And honestly, I mitigated that risk. Hopefully it worked out, but I was very open with the hiring manager at the time, with the chief of staff, that I'm happy to take this position. I want to do this for you, but with the understanding of where I see this going. And so let's be really honest and frank about if that's an option or not. And the chief of staff understood and agreed that, I'm coming with this experience, and you're not hiring a lifelong executive assistant. You're going to have to potentially, hopefully, replace me in a year or two, because my goal is to move into a different space. And the risk paid off for me. I was very lucky. 8 months later, someone in the policy shop left, and she kept her word, and she promoted me into that position instead of somebody else. And so it was a risk. I didn't know how it was going to pay off, but I still go back to having that honest conversation right up front and not being afraid to say, this is what I'm also hoping to get out of this. This is what I want to do. I think really helped me out. And I think, to Sharad's point is, if it had not worked out that way, then it would have been incredibly clear why it didn't work out and what didn't happen. And there would have been not a lot of space for misinterpretation, which would have been a really good learning experience for me in terms of next steps. So that's just a little experience where it did likely, I was very lucky, it worked out in my favor. But yeah, I think honesty is really the best policy, just like our mothers taught us.
Thank you. So we have just a couple more minutes left. And so for those who are on this webinar who might be looking for jobs, they've graduated, they're job seekers. Do you have any final kind of words of advice for those who might be looking for ideas or looking for jobs, and anything that you can share with them? Sort of final words of advice.
Sure. Do not box yourself in. You cannot say no to a job you didn't apply for. Stop worrying so much. If the perfect job description exists, if the perfect salary requirement exists, apply for the job and worry about saying no to the job after you've received an offer. You would be amazed at how job descriptions can shift, job titles can shift. Everything is fungible when you start having these conversations. So just go out there and get after it. And also, don't worry about the title. Worry more about who you're going to be working for. Worry more about who you're going to be surrounded by and who your network is going to be, than exactly what the job title is there. Look at the trajectory of the career. Look at who you're surrounded yourself by. And I just cannot stress this enough. Like, do not be afraid of being pigeonholed. You cannot say no to a job you did not apply for.
That's good advice, Sadaf. The only other thing that I'd sort of add is one, there are many avenues for you to reach out and connect with people. LinkedIn is there, but there are many other avenues, Reddit, surprisingly enough. And something that's helped me recently is called Blind. Very interesting professional network, people who are working in companies and in roles which you might want to sort of do, but incredibly open with giving advice, conversing, and recommendations. It's called Blind. I think the only other thing, and that's to add to the pigeonholing point that Sadaf said, always keep the growth mindset on. It really pays when you're flexible and when you follow what you want to do, no matter what sort of space you're put into. The growth mindset really helps.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. I think we've reached the end of our second series. We explore possibilities. I want to thank Sheridan and Sadaf, our two alumni speakers, for all of the insight that they provided us. I think this is a very helpful way and sort of a helpful conversation for those of us sort of thinking about next steps and how to generate ideas for going forward. What I will say is, so we will continue with these different events next week. So next Thursday at 2 p.m. is the next in our series of vision chats led by our Vice Provost, Dr. Farouk Day. So please take a look at the Integrated Learning and Life Design website, where this, the website that you registered for this event on. There will also be links to vision chats. So, and there's just been and there's also been a thing that's sort of just been added to everyone in the chat. Our community, for finding our community conversation prompt. So if you want to continue with the conversation and continue to be a part of this discussion. So on behalf of everyone on the Integrated Learning and Life Design team, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you again, Sheridan and Sadaf, for all that you've done for us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Justin.